when the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in April 1861. Most Europeans believed the conflict across the Atlantic would be short and clumsy. To inexperienced armies, citizen soldiers, outdated generals, many expected it to be little more than a colonial rebellion wrapped in political drama. They were wrong. As the American Civil War dragged on, foreign observers, British officers, Prussian strategists, French engineers watched with growing unease. What unfolded in the United States was not a backward war. It was something far more dangerous. It was the first modern war. By the time the guns fell silent in 1865, millions were dead, landscapes were destroyed, and warfare itself had changed forever. The world had been given a preview of the future, and it was terrifying. Before the Civil War, old wars, old assumptions, mid-19th century warfare was still shaped by Napoleonic traditions. Armies marched in tight formations. Infantry fought shoulder to shoulder. Cavalry charges decided battles. Artillery supported but rarely dominated. European generals believed discipline, courage, and maneuver mattered more than raw firepower. Wars were expected to be short and decisive. Losses were heavy but manageable. The American Civil War shattered every one of these assumptions. Rifled muskets. The death of close-order combatant of the most important lessons came from a simple technological change. The rifled musket, unlike smoothbore muskets, rifled weapons had far greater range, were dramatically more accurate, allowed soldiers to hit targets hundreds of meters away. Generals continued using Napoleonic tactics, ordering massed infantry to advance in tight lines. The result was catastrophic. Men were cut down long before they could reach the enemy. Battles like Antietam, Gettysburg, and Fredericksburg produced casualties on a scale unseen in previous wars. Foreign observers learned a brutal lesson: firepower had outpaced tactics. This imbalance would haunt European armies for decades until it exploded again in World War I. Trenches, a glimpse of the future long before the Western Front of 1914. American soldiers dug into the earth. As weapons became deadlier, survival depended on cover. Trenches, earthworks, and field fortifications appeared everywhere from Petersburg to Vicksburg. These were not temporary defenses. They became permanent battlefields. European officers watching the war took careful notes. Defensive positions now favored the defender. Heavily frontal assaults were suicidal. Wars would become longer and more static. 50 years later, those lessons would resurface in mud, barbed wire, and machine gun fire across Europe. Total war. Civilians are no longer safe. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson was not tactical, but moral. The American Civil War introduced the world to total war. Union generals like William Tecumseh Sherman understood that destroying enemy armies was not enough. To win, they had to destroy railroads, factories, farms. Civilian militiamen marched to the sea. Shocked European observers. Armies were no longer just fighting soldiers, they were dismantling entire societies. The message was clear: modern war targets nations, not just armies. This idea would later define conflicts of the 20th century. Railroads, the arteries of modern warfare. No previous war had depended so heavily on railroads. Trains allowed armies to move troops rapidly across vast distances. Supply front lines continuously replaced losses faster than ever before. Victory increasingly depended on industrial capacity and logistics, not heroic charges. European militaries realized something unsettling. Wars would now be won by factories, rail networks, and mobilization speed. This lesson deeply influenced German and French were planning before 1914. Telegraphs and command control. For the first time, commanders could communicate with distant armies almost instantly. Telegraphs allowed centralized command, rapid response to battlefield changes, coordinated multi-front operations. But that also introduced new problems. Information overload, delayed decision-making, micromanagement. From distant capitals, Civil War showed that modern communication could be both a strength and a weakness. A problem future armies would struggle to balance. Ironclads and the death of wooden navies in 1862. Two ships met in battle that stunned the world: USS Monitor and CSS Virginia. This clash ended the age of wooden warships overnight. Ironclads proved armor could defeat traditional naval guns. Steam power-free ships from wind. Naval warfare was entering a new era. European navies immediately began redesigning their fleets, just as Dreadnought would later do. The Civil War forced naval powers to confront technological obsolescence. Medical reality: war is a mass casualty event. The Civil War killed more Americans than all other U.S. wars combined. But but many deaths came not from bullets but from disease, infection, poor sanitation. At the same time, the war drove medical innovation, ambulance systems, field hospitals, triage methods. Organized nursing observers learned that modern war would produce casualties on an industrial scale and that medical systems would be as important as weapons. Leadership under fire. The end of the hero general civil war exposed a painful truth. Charisma and bravery were no longer enough. Generals who failed to adapt to, relied on outdated tactics, were slaughtering their own men. Successful commanders were those who understood logistics, managed resources, accepted defensive warfare, learned from failure. This lesson reshaped military education worldwide, particularly in Prussia, where officers studied the war intensely. National mobilization. War becomes a social effort. The American Civil War demonstrated that modern wars required entire societies to participate. Governments mobilized, industry, agriculture, finance, media, public opinion, conscription, propaganda, and economic control became normal tools of war. European states watching carefully realized future wars would not be fought by professional armies alone, but by nations in arms. The cost of ignoring the lessons despite careful observation. Many lessons were misunderstood or ignored. European armies adopted new weapons but clung to old doctrines. When World War I erupted, generals repeated the same mistakes. Mass infantry assaults, underestimating defensive firepower, belief in quick victorious. The result was slaughter on an even greater scale. The American Civil War had shown the future. The world simply refused to listen fully. Why the American Civil War still matters. Civil War sits at the crossroads of history. It is the bridge between old wars and industrial wars, line battles and trench warfare, limited conflict, and total war. Its lessons echo through every modern conflict from world wars to modern insurgencies. To study it is to understand how war stopped being romantic and became mechanical. Final reflection. The American Civil War was not just a national tragedy. It was a global warning. The world learned how deadly modern warfare could be, but learned it too slowly. Did the world truly understand the Civil War's lessons? Or are we still repeating its mistakes today? If this deep dive changed how you see history, like, share, and subscribe, and tell me which lesson from the Civil War you think still matters most now.